They thought the water would carry them all the way to the beach. It didn't. The landing craft stopped, hundreds of meters from shore. For a moment, there was confusion. Engines strained, men looked ahead, expecting the final push forward. It never came. Instead, they were ordered to get out, into open water. With rifles held above their heads, U.S. Marines began moving forward on foot, exposed, slowed by the reef beneath them and fully visible from the shore. That's when the firing started. What had been planned as a controlled landing turned into a crossing under direct fire. Tarawa, the landing that went wrong. The approach to the atoll began under assumptions that did not hold once the first landing craft reached the reef. Pre-invasion bombardment had been extensive, delivered by a naval gunfire and carrier aircraft with the expectation that fixed defenses would be suppressed long enough for assault waves to cross the lagoon and reach the beach with minimal resistance. Planning estimates treated the crossing as a short, controlled movement. That assessment depended on water depth across the reef being sufficient for landing craft to pass. It was not. As the first waves of U.S. Marines advanced toward the island, many craft grounded on the coral barrier well short of the shoreline. Engines strained against the reef, propellers churning in place. With forward movement halted, units were forced to disembark under observation. The distance to the beach varied, but for many it required movement on foot across exposed, waist-deep water over uneven coral, with equipment held above the surface to keep weapons functional. Japanese defenses, positioned to cover the approaches rather than the waterline alone, began to engage with increasing precision. Machine gun nests and coastal guns were oriented to deliver interlocking fire across the lagoon approaches, exploiting the fixed lanes created by the reef and the limited avenues of advance. Fields of fire overlapped, creating zones where movement slowed and formations lost cohesion. The absence of immediate cover compounded the effect. Individual Marines attempted to use scattered obstacles, damaged craft, equipment bundles, and the reef's irregularities, but these provided only partial concealment. Command and control degraded quickly at the point of contact. Radio equipment exposed to water during the disembarkation became unreliable. Units that had been organized for coordinated assault on the beach found themselves fragmented before reaching it. Officers and non-commissioned leaders shifted from planned maneuver to immediate, localized control, directing small groups toward any reachable section of shoreline. The objective remained unchanged, but the method became improvised. Naval gunfire support continued, but its effectiveness was constrained by proximity. As Marines closed on the beach, firing solutions had to be adjusted to avoid friendly casualties, reducing the weight of fire that could be delivered against positions immediately inland. Air support faced similar limitations, with targets difficult to distinguish through smoke, dust, and the disrupted geometry of the landing zones. The transition from preparatory bombardment to close support exposed a gap in which defenders retained operational capacity. Engineering elements intended to clear obstacles and facilitate movement ashore were delayed or scattered during the crossing. Equipment required for rapid breaching and clearance was not always available at the point of need. This slowed the establishment of viable landing lanes and compounded congestion in the shallow approaches. Supply movement followed the same pattern. Ammunition and medical materials remained tied to craft that could not reach the beach, forcing forward elements to operate with what they carried. Despite these conditions, small groups began to reach the shoreline. Entry points were not evenly distributed. Instead, they formed where terrain features or momentary lapses in fire allowed movement. These footholds were narrow and unstable, often isolated from one another by active defensive positions. The initial objective, securing a continuous line along the beach, remained incomplete as the first hours unfolded. The consequence of the disrupted landing was immediate. Units that had been intended to arrive in sequence and mass were instead committed piecemeal, reducing their ability to apply concentrated force. The defenders' use of terrain and prepared positions translated directly into time during which the attackers remained exposed, reorganizing under fire. The operation had not stalled, but it had deviated from plan at the point where momentum was most critical. The shoreline, once reached, did not offer immediate relief. It marked the transition from exposed movement across water to close engagement against positions embedded just beyond the sand. The conditions that had shaped the approach, restricted lanes, overlapping fire, and limited support, continued to influence the fight as the first elements established a presence on land, securing a foothold. The first Marines who reached the shoreline did so in fragments, arriving in small groups rather than organized waves. The beach itself was narrow, bordered by seawalls, debris, and defensive works that limited movement and visibility. Instead of a continuous line, the American presence consisted of isolated pockets, each holding a section of sand under direct fire from positions just inland. The priority shifted immediately from advancing inland to stabilizing what had already been gained. Japanese defensive planning emphasized depth rather than a simple shoreline defense. Positions were constructed to survive bombardment and to deliver fire from concealed locations slightly back from the beach. As a result, even after reaching land, Marines remained exposed to enfilade fire from multiple directions. Machine guns and rifles engaged any movement along the shoreline, while mortars targeted areas where troops began to cluster. Command decisions at this stage focused on consolidation. Officers worked to identify unit elements within reach and reorganize them into functional groups. Communication remained inconsistent. Radios that had survived the crossing were limited in range or reliability, forcing reliance on runners moving under fire. This slowed coordination between adjacent positions and delayed the establishment of a coherent front. Terrain played a decisive role in shaping the immediate fight. The narrowness of the beach restricted maneuver, and obstacles, both natural and man-made, forced troops into predictable paths. Seawalls, while offering some protection, also created choke points where movement inland could be controlled by defenders. Gaps in these barriers became critical objectives, not because they were easily accessible, but because they represented the only viable routes forward. Efforts to breach these obstacles began with whatever resources were available at the point of contact. Engineers, when present, attempted to clear paths through wire and debris, but many had been delayed or separated during the landing. Infantry units adapted by using small arms, grenades, and improvised methods to create limited openings. Progress was measured in meters, often requiring repeated attempts under sustained fire. Naval gunfire and air support continued to play a role, but their application was constrained by the proximity of friendly forces. Spotting for fire missions proved difficult. The smoke and confusion of the landing zone obscured targets, and forward observers were not always in position to provide accurate adjustments. When effective, these fires suppressed key defensive points, allowing brief windows for movement. When misaligned, they offered little immediate relief. Logistical challenges became increasingly evident. Ammunition expenditure rose rapidly due to the intensity of close-range engagements, while resupply remained inconsistent. Landing craft that managed to reach the beach delivered critical materials, but congestion and continued enemy fire limited the rate at which supplies could be distributed. Medical evacuation faced similar obstacles, with wounded personnel often remaining in exposed positions longer than planned. Despite these constraints, incremental gains were made. Small groups succeeded in moving beyond the immediate shoreline, securing limited areas that could serve as staging points for further advance. These positions were not continuous or strongly linked, but they provided a foothold from which additional forces could operate. The process of linking these isolated pockets became the next operational priority. Japanese forces responded by maintaining pressure on these developing positions. Rather than counterattacking in large formations, they relied on sustained, localized engagements to prevent consolidation. This approach exploited the fragmented nature of the American presence and extended the period during which attackers remained vulnerable. By the end of this phase, the situation had stabilized only in relative terms. The Marines had established a presence on land, but it lacked depth and cohesion. The initial objective of securing a firm beachhead had not yet been fully achieved. Instead, the battle had transitioned into a series of close, contested engagements along a confined front where control of small sections of terrain carried disproportionate importance. Breaking the seawall. With a tenuous line established along sections of the beach, the next objective became unavoidable: movement inland. The shoreline offered no lasting security. It was a staging area under continuous observation, where exposure to fire could not be reduced without pushing through the first line of defenses. The barrier between the beach and the interior, seawalls, trenches, and reinforced positions, defined the next phase of the operation. The defensive layout was not linear. Japanese forces had constructed positions with overlapping arcs of fire that extended both across the beach and back toward likely avenues of advance. Seawalls served a dual purpose. They offered partial cover to attackers who reached them, but they also marked the point where movement inland could be channeled and controlled. Behind these barriers, defensive positions were arranged to engage any breach attempt from multiple directions. American units adapted by focusing on localized breakthroughs rather than a coordinated advance across the entire front. Small assault teams formed around available leaders and weapons, moving toward identified weak points. These points were rarely obvious. They emerged where fire was momentarily reduced or where terrain irregularities created limited blind spots. Identifying and exploiting such opportunities required constant observation under fire. Close quarters engagement became the dominant form of combat. Rifles and automatic weapons were used at short range, while grenades were employed to clear trenches and firing points immediately beyond the seawall. The confined terrain reduced the advantage of longer-range fire and placed emphasis on speed and coordination within small groups. Movement was often measured in a few steps at a time, each requiring covering fire and precise timing. Command and control continued to operate at a decentralized level. With communication still inconsistent, decisions were made by junior leaders at the point of contact. This allowed for rapid adaptation but limited the ability to synchronize efforts across the broader front. Adjacent units often advanced at different rates, creating gaps that defenders could exploit with flanking fire. Support elements worked to align with these localized assaults. Naval gunfire, when effectively directed, targeted deeper positions that could not be reached by infantry weapons. Air support focused on visible strongpoints, though identification remained difficult due to smoke and the proximity of friendly forces. The integration of these fires depended heavily on forward observers, whose ability to communicate directly influenced the effectiveness of support. Engineers played a critical role in breaching obstacles. Where present, they used explosives to create openings in defensive structures, allowing infantry to pass through more quickly. However, their distribution remained uneven. In many sectors, infantry units conducted breaching operations without dedicated engineering support, relying on improvised methods that increased both time and exposure. Logistics began to stabilize incrementally. Additional landing craft reached the shore, bringing ammunition and limited equipment necessary for sustained operations. Establishing even a partial flow of supplies allowed forward units to maintain pressure rather than pause due to shortages. Medical evacuation improved as more organized routes were identified, though conditions remained difficult. The consequences of successful breaches were immediate but localized. Where Marines pushed beyond the seawall, they gained access to interior positions that could serve as footholds for further advance. These gains, however, were not uniform. Progress in one sector did not automatically translate to progress in another, and the front remained uneven. Japanese forces adjusted by reinforcing positions that were under direct threat while maintaining fire on areas where advances had stalled. Their approach continued to emphasize the disruption of American momentum rather than holding a rigid line. This created a dynamic battlefield in which control shifted gradually, often without clear demarcation. By the end of this phase, the Marines had begun to penetrate the initial defensive belt. The shoreline was no longer the sole area of engagement. Instead, the fight extended into the first layers of interior defenses, where terrain and prepared positions would continue to shape the pace and direction of operations, fighting through the interior. Beyond the first defensive belt, the character of the battle changed without becoming less constrained. The terrain shifted from the narrow strip of beach to a dense arrangement of trenches, bunkers, and hardened positions integrated into the island's limited interior space. Movement inland did not open the field. It introduced a layered defense in which each advance exposed the attacker to new angles of fire. Japanese positions were constructed with an emphasis on concealment and mutual support. Rather than isolated strongpoints, they functioned as interconnected nodes, allowing defenders to withdraw from one position and re-engage from another. Fields of fire overlapped across likely avenues of approach, and the use of covered routes enabled defenders to shift personnel without immediate exposure. This reduced the effectiveness of isolated breakthroughs and forced the Marines to clear positions methodically. American units adapted by organizing assaults around combined arms at the smallest practical scale. Infantry elements identified and fixed defensive positions with direct fire while supporting weapons, machine guns, mortars, and where available, heavier ordnance were used to suppress adjacent threats. The objective was not rapid advance, but controlled reduction of each position in sequence. Progress depended on coordination between these elements rather than speed. Terrain features dictated the pace of operations. Shallow depressions, embankments, and constructed barriers created natural lines of resistance. Even minor elevation changes could conceal a firing position or limit visibility to a few meters. As a result, reconnaissance became critical. Forward elements advanced cautiously, probing for enemy positions before committing larger groups. Mistimed movement could expose entire sections to concentrated fire. Command decisions at this stage emphasized maintaining pressure while avoiding overextension. Units that advanced too far without support risked isolation, particularly given the fragmented nature of the front. Leaders worked to align adjacent elements, closing gaps where possible and reinforcing sectors that encountered strong resistance. This required constant adjustment, as progress in one area could create vulnerabilities in another. Fire support continued to influence the engagement, though its application remained constrained. Naval gunfire targeted deeper or more heavily fortified positions, particularly those identified as coordinating points for defensive fire. Air support was used selectively, often against positions that could be clearly marked and isolated from friendly forces. The effectiveness of these measures depended on accurate observation and communication, both of which were challenged by the environment. Engineering support became more consistent as additional personnel and equipment reached the interior. Demolition charges were used to neutralize bunkers and fortified positions that could not be suppressed by small arms alone. This process was deliberate and time-consuming, requiring close coordination between engineers and infantry to ensure both access and protection during placement of charges. Logistical systems improved incrementally. Supply routes were established from the shoreline to forward positions, allowing for more reliable distribution of ammunition and medical support. These routes were often exposed and required protection, but their existence enabled sustained operations rather than intermittent advances. The ability to maintain pressure depended directly on the continuity of these supply lines. Japanese forces continued to resist through a combination of static defense and localized counteractions. Rather than large-scale counterattacks, they relied on immediate responses to penetrations, attempting to isolate and contain advancing elements. This approach leveraged their knowledge of the terrain and the interconnected nature of their defensive system. By the end of this phase, control of the interior remained contested but had begun to shift. The Marines had extended their presence beyond the initial defensive layers and established positions that allowed for continued advance. However, the cost of each gain remained high, and the structure of the defense ensured that further progress would require the same methodical approach applied thus far. Compression of the defensive system. As the Marines extended their positions inland, the operational focus shifted from penetration to compression. Earlier gains had created a series of footholds within the defensive network. The next objective was to connect these footholds and reduce the space in which Japanese forces could maneuver. This required coordinated movement along multiple axes, not to achieve rapid advance, but to limit the defender's ability to reposition and maintain overlapping fields of fire. The terrain continued to constrain movement. Interior positions were arranged around shallow depressions, trench lines, and reinforced structures that defined narrow corridors of approach. These corridors were not continuous. They were broken by obstacles and concealed firing points that forced advancing units to halt, identify, and neutralize each threat before proceeding. The result was a segmented battlefield in which progress occurred in short, controlled movements rather than sustained advances. American command decisions emphasized lateral coordination. Units that had advanced independently were directed to align their positions, reducing gaps that could be exploited by defenders. This required communication across sectors that had previously operated in isolation. While radio reliability had improved with the establishment of more stable positions, line-of-sight limitations and the density of the battlefield still imposed delays. Coordination often depended on prearranged signals and the physical movement of messengers. Fire support was adjusted to support this phase. Rather than focusing solely on deep targets, naval gunfire and mortars were increasingly used to isolate specific sections of the defensive system. By suppressing adjacent positions, these fires created temporary reductions in defensive capability, allowing infantry to move between footholds and establish continuous lines. The timing of these fires was critical. Delays or misalignment could expose advancing elements to renewed engagement. Engineers contributed to the compression effort by clearing obstacles that prevented lateral movement. Wire entanglements, damaged structures, and terrain irregularities were addressed to create passable routes between positions. This work often took place under intermittent fire, requiring coordination with infantry elements providing security. The establishment of these routes enabled more consistent movement of both personnel and supplies. Logistical support reached a more stable phase. Supply lines from the shoreline to forward positions were reinforced and, where possible, diversified to reduce vulnerability. Ammunition flow became more predictable, allowing units to sustain engagements without interruption. Medical evacuation improved as routes were secured, reducing the time wounded personnel remained in exposed positions. These developments did not eliminate risk, but they reduced the operational impact of earlier disruptions. Japanese forces responded to the compression of their defensive system by intensifying localized resistance. As their maneuver space decreased, they relied more heavily on the strength of individual positions and the continued use of covered routes to shift between them. Counteractions remained limited in scale but were executed with precision, targeting areas where American units were attempting to link positions. The objective was to prevent the formation of a continuous front. Despite these efforts, the balance began to shift. As footholds were connected, the Marines gained the ability to apply pressure across a broader front. This reduced the effectiveness of isolated defensive positions, which could now be engaged from multiple directions. The interconnected nature of the defense, once an advantage, became a liability when segments were cut off from one another. The consequence of this phase was not a rapid collapse of resistance, but a gradual reduction in defensive flexibility. Japanese forces retained the ability to contest ground, but their options for repositioning and mutual support diminished. The battlefield became more defined, with clearer lines of control emerging as isolated pockets of resistance were identified and contained. By the end of this stage, the Marines had transformed a fragmented set of positions into a more coherent front. This did not end the engagement, but it altered its character. The remaining task was the systematic reduction of isolated positions within a compressed defensive space, where the outcome would be determined by persistence and the continued application of coordinated force. Reduction of isolated strongpoints. With the defensive system compressed, the remaining task centered on the deliberate reduction of positions that no longer had effective lateral support. These strongpoints, often reinforced and concealed, retained the capacity to inflict casualties despite their isolation. The operational approach shifted toward controlled elimination rather than continued advance, with emphasis on coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting fires. Each position presented a distinct problem. Some were constructed with multiple firing apertures oriented in different directions, allowing defenders to engage approaching forces from several angles. Others were integrated into terrain features that limited visibility and provided natural protection. The absence of immediate supporting positions did not reduce their effectiveness. In some cases, it concentrated defensive effort within a smaller area, increasing resistance at the point of contact. American units approached these positions methodically. Initial contact involved identification and fixation, using small arms and automatic weapons to prevent defenders from shifting or reinforcing their positions. This was followed by suppression, often through mortars or direct fire from heavier weapons, brought forward as supply routes stabilized. The objective was to limit the defender's ability to engage while preparing for close assault. Engineers played a central role in the final phase of reduction. Demolition charges were employed to neutralize fortified structures that could not be cleared by small arms alone. Placement of these charges required close proximity, often under intermittent fire, and depended on precise coordination with infantry elements providing cover. In areas where engineering support was not immediately available, infantry units adapted by using available means to achieve similar effects, though at increased risk. Fire support continued to contribute, particularly against positions that could be clearly identified and isolated from friendly forces. Naval gunfire and air support were applied selectively, focusing on targets that could not be effectively engaged from the ground. The challenge remained one of observation and communication. Accurate targeting required confirmation of position and clear separation from advancing units. Logistics sustained the pace of operations. Ammunition requirements remained high due to the intensity of close engagements, and the established supply routes ensured that forward elements could maintain pressure without interruption. Medical support improved further as evacuation routes were secured and expanded, reducing delays in treatment and transport. These factors contributed to the ability to conduct repeated coordinated assaults on remaining positions. Japanese forces, though increasingly isolated, continued to resist with determination. Their use of concealed routes within individual positions allowed for limited repositioning, and their familiarity with the terrain enabled them to exploit any lapse in coordination. Counteractions were localized and often focused on disrupting assault preparations rather than reclaiming lost ground. The objective remained to delay and inflict maximum cost. As individual strongpoints were reduced, the overall structure of resistance weakened. The loss of interconnected positions limited the defender's ability to sustain coordinated fire, and isolated elements became more vulnerable to focused assault. The process was gradual, requiring repeated application of the same methods across multiple locations. By the conclusion of this phase, control of the interior had shifted decisively. Remaining resistance was confined to scattered positions without effective support or the ability to influence broader operations. The battle had moved from contested advance to systematic clearance, where the outcome depended on the continued application of established tactics rather than the introduction of new ones. Consolidation and operational outcome. With the majority of organized resistance reduced to isolated pockets, the focus shifted from active assault to consolidation. The objective was to convert fragmented gains into stable control, ensuring that the area could support continued operations and deny any remaining defender the ability to reconstitute. This phase required as much coordination as the earlier assaults, though the tempo of engagement began to change. American units moved to secure the terrain already taken, reinforcing positions and establishing clear lines of control. Defensive perimeters were defined to prevent infiltration from remaining enemy elements. While large-scale resistance had diminished, the presence of concealed positions meant that movement still required caution. Patrols were organized to locate and neutralize any remaining threats, often encountering isolated defenders who continued to resist within prepared positions. Command decisions emphasized organization and stability. Units that had operated in dispersed formations during earlier phases were restructured into more coherent elements. This allowed for more reliable communication and coordination, both within individual units and across the broader operational area. The re-establishment of command networks improved the ability to direct remaining clearance operations and manage resources. Engineering efforts expanded beyond breaching and demolition. The focus shifted to improving mobility and infrastructure within the secured area. Obstacles were cleared to create usable routes for personnel and equipment, and damaged terrain was adapted to support logistical movement. These efforts enabled more efficient distribution of supplies and facilitated the movement of heavier equipment that had been delayed during the initial phases of the operation. Logistics reached a level of consistency that had not been possible earlier. Supply lines from the shoreline to interior positions were secured and expanded, allowing for sustained support without the interruptions that had characterized the initial landing. Ammunition, medical materials, and other essential supplies were delivered in a more predictable manner, reducing the operational strain on forward units. Medical support improved significantly as evacuation routes became reliable. Wounded personnel could be moved more quickly from forward positions to treatment areas, reducing delays that had previously impacted survival and recovery. This change reflected the broader shift from contested movement to controlled operation within secured terrain. Fire support, while still available, was used more selectively. With friendly forces occupying most of the area, the risk of unintended impact increased, requiring careful coordination for any remaining strikes. Instead, emphasis was placed on ground-based methods for clearing residual resistance. This included continued use of infantry and engineering teams to address isolated positions that could not be bypassed. Japanese forces, reduced to small, disconnected groups, continued to resist where they could. Without the ability to coordinate or maneuver effectively, their actions had limited impact on the overall outcome. However, their continued presence required sustained attention, as even isolated positions could disrupt local operations if left unaddressed. The strategic effect of the operation became clear as consolidation progressed. Control of the area provided a position from which further operations could be supported, fulfilling the broader objective that had driven the initial assault. The cost of achieving this control, however, reflected the challenges encountered at every stage, from the disrupted landing to the methodical reduction of fortified positions. By the end of the operation, the battlefield had been transformed from a contested landing zone into a controlled area capable of supporting ongoing military activity. The process had been neither rapid nor straightforward. It required continuous adaptation to terrain, enemy tactics, and logistical constraints. The outcome was defined not by a single decisive action, but by the cumulative effect of coordinated efforts across all phases of the operation.